This video is part of Design Bytes Season 1, covering game design on The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild. All 5 episodes are available to watch now, so make sure you check them out after this one. Season 1 will contain some spoilers, so it's recommended that you play Breath of the Wild first before watching these episodes. Enjoy! I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the weapon durability mechanic found in The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild. It was quite the change for the series to take away a permanent weapon from Link, and it seems to be the one thing from Breath of the Wild that draws dissenting opinions like a lightning rod. Personally, I found myself shifting between both ends of the spectrum during my travels in Hyrule. Objectively, it's a rare instance of a mechanic that's hard to nail down as a good or bad inclusion. Get ready to break absolutely everything, because this episode of Design Bytes will explore how the weapon durability system works, its positive and negative implications on Breath of the Wild's design, and how Nintendo's designers could have made a few tweaks to improve the overall experience. The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild is a mechanically rich game with all kinds of options available to the player. But unlike previous games in the series, Nintendo decided to make a significant change in the way Link interacts with offensive and defensive pieces of gear. Past Zelda titles always granted Link access to some sort of permanent melee weapon and shield for use in combat, and both of these pieces usually had a starter version that could be upgraded later in the adventure. I've always liked the structure in Zelda games that have had somewhat linear progression, because it's a good way for Nintendo's designers to make these upgrades a plot point while also being a way to control the difficulty curve. It's a simple and easily understandable way to treat weapons in the context of a linear Zelda game. But of course, we all know that Breath of the Wild was specifically designed to be non-linear, so that approach wasn't going to cut it when embracing the open world nature of this title. Instead of having a couple pieces of gear, Link now has a massive inventory of weapons consisting of bows, shields, and melee weapons. These come in 3 different flavors: traditional swords with mid-level range, speed, and damage, long-range spears with quick attack speed and low damage, and slow but powerful axe-type weapons that hit hard but are difficult to wield. All weapons now have a set amount of damage they will inflict on enemies, and they can also potentially have elemental affinities associated with them like electricity or ice. Players can increase their amount of weapon and shield slots by collecting enough Korok seeds scattered throughout the world, which are rewards for noticing patterns, solving micro-puzzles, and for searching the nooks and crannies throughout the map. But most critically, all weapons will now break after being used in combat when striking bad guys or when used on objects throughout Hyrule. This new system centered around weapon durability is one of the driving forces of Breath of the Wild's design. And I think Nintendo chose to go this route primarily because it promotes the exploration component of the adventure. Having broken equipment creates an ever-present cycle where players will first explore the world to find a weapon, use it, have it break, and then be forced to find a new one again to repeat the process. The core of this mechanic is rooted in that first exploration step of the cycle, and while I love Nintendo's willingness to try something new in this instance, it's a double-edged sword that creates a dichotomy full of positives and negatives. Let's start with the good stuff, because I definitely feel like Nintendo was successful with the durability mechanic in a lot of ways. The most noticeable one is that players who are more willing to explore Hyrule will be rewarded with better equipment to take on its challenges. Players who feel a strong attachment to the experience Breath of the Wild provides are probably going to be the ones that like to uncover everything about a world, so this system will have a lot of appeal to them. Breath of the Wild is teeming with those small yes moments when players come across a newly discovered or particularly useful weapon that's better than Link's current collection. I had a ton of yes moments during my playthrough, and I remember a lot of them, such as when I found the 8-fold Longblade on the hills near Kakariko, or when I was blessed with elemental weapons for the first time from a Stalnox I took down. The Korok Seed side quest is an important component of the weapon durability mechanic because it's intrinsically tied to it and also boasts exploration. Since weapons will break all the time, it's important to have as many slots as possible to always create a stockpile of resources. This creates a nice relationship where collecting more Korok seeds means that having a weapon break is less impactful, because there should be more available weapons for Link to use as compensation. From an exploration point of view, it's a great design choice that ties two major mechanics together, and it enhances both of them while giving them each more purpose. The weapon durability mechanic also promotes strategy and experimentation in combat situations. Since there is no permanent weapon, players at some point will have to learn the ins and outs of each different weapon class and develop a basic competence with them all. Breath of the Wild even has a secondary mechanic added on top of this. When a weapon is near its breaking point, indicated by a red flash, it will deal double the damage on the last hit, so players always have strategic access to a desperation move when a weapon is about to go. Combat also reinforces a specific type of feedback loop unique to the weapon durability mechanic. Fighting may cost a player weapons, but players may get other weapons back from the enemies they've defeated, which may be equal, better, or worse. It constantly forces players to make a series of micro decisions that add up over the course of a playthrough, since coming across enemy camps means that players must survey the situation and come to the conclusion whether or not it's worth investing resources into. However, these types of combat scenarios start to illustrate places where the durability mechanic in Breath of the Wild can start to lose some players. By default, having weapons consistently breaking means that at all times, players are engaged in that passive resource management whether they realize it or not. Combat can drain Link's resources since he'll be using weapons to fight, so a lot of players will feel like the choice to engage enemies is an overall detriment to their status. For that specific group of players who feel that way, avoiding conflict may be seen as the optimal strategy. Even within a battle, players might find themselves in a scenario where they take a ton of damage or even experience a death because a piece of equipment broke at an inopportune time, leading to frustration. I do think Breath of the Wild presents its combat scenarios fairly in a way where players can adequately make these decisions, but there were a lot of times where I avoided fighting battles solely for the reason that the trade-off of weapons spent versus weapons gained wasn't worth it. The beginning of Link's adventure suffers a lot from this resource management problem too, because at the start of the game, he will not have the necessary gear and status to maximize both his combat and exploration capabilities. The Great Plateau lends itself well to introducing everything about Breath of the Wild, including how the weapon durability mechanic is a major aspect of the game, but the cost for learning this system is pretty high. The beginning of the game doesn't really give players a clear and replenishable stockpile of weapons while they're still learning basic mechanics, so there will definitely be some people who outright avoid enemy set pieces because they may not be sure how long it will be before they get their resources back. I probably went through hundreds of Boko clubs and Boko spears before I got the hang of it, and admittedly, this did leave an initial negative impression on the durability mechanic because I didn't realize how many weapons would be made available to me during my adventure. I think a lot of other players who feel negatively about this durability system might have had a similar experience at the start of the game. And that leads nicely to the last notable flaw I think plagues the weapon durability mechanic in Breath of the Wild. It's something that my experience with the Great Plateau's scarcity taught me early: hoarding. Remember how I mentioned that I found an 8-fold longblade early in my adventure? No joke, I held onto that sword for over 50 hours of playtime, and I refused to use it because its damage output was more than double of any other weapon I had in my inventory at the time. Back then, I didn't know what was coming next, and I certainly didn't know where the sword ranked amongst all weapons, so I stashed it thinking it would be best to save it for a critical moment later. There was always a contrast for me between the high of finding a cool and powerful weapon and the low of always wanting to keep it. This, for me, is the main reason why I can't totally be convinced to join the pro durability team, because I couldn't stop doing it throughout my entire adventure, whether it was intentional or not. One of the major appeals of Breath of the Wild is that you can run into anything at any time, so there was never really an incentive to use better equipment until I was forced to, which meant that a lot of my gear got stuck in the inventory for a ton of time. The Korok Seed side quest here is a double-edged sword, because the increased number of slots give more opportunities to hoard, and that's exactly what I did. Oh, there's one last small but surprisingly impactful thing to consider about the weapon durability mechanic. The constant breakage means that players will be menuing a lot throughout their entire adventure. It's nowhere near a deal breaker for a lot of players, but given the incredible scope of Breath of the Wild, there's potentially hours of intermittent menuing that won't be avoidable. It's an unfortunate side effect of the weapon durability system. So with all that said and both sides considered, what should Nintendo's designers have done to improve the durability mechanic? There's probably not a definitive answer here objectively, But for me personally, there is something simple that would have made weapon durability more manageable: access to 2 permanent weapons. I would place one of these weapons near the start of the game, and then would make the second one a secret reward for progressing through the game. In both cases, the weapon should be weaker and less effective than what could be obtained organically in the world at those given times. But I like this approach because it means there's always a reason to engage in combat without diminishing the reward for exploration. It still encourages weapon variety in combat since players will still have a more powerful selection at any given time. There is a counterpoint to this approach, and it's that a permanent weapon may cause players to only use that one weapon consistently, causing combat to stale. It's a valid concern, but it's a trade-off I'm willing to personally accept if it streamlines everything else. Another suggestion that I see a lot online from the community is that the game should feature a restoration or crafting system that uses enemy drops or materials to fix broken or near broken gear. I like this idea because it gives players yet another reason to constantly collect things from all over Hyrule, and it fits well within the game since it does this already for cooking. But I feel like it would diminish the reward for players actually finding new weapons since they can choose to restore their current ones instead. It also means that players have to learn and remember an entirely new set of item combinations, which adds a notable amount of complexity to the game. I think making weapons more durable as a whole is probably a better solution to a restoration system, but depending on its execution, I could be persuaded to either side. In fairness to Breath of the Wild, Nintendo did put one weapon in the game that is semi-permanent, but the way it works is just odd and it leaves a lot to be desired. The Master Sword is a Zelda staple, and it can be obtained in the Korok Forest after players have completed a good amount of shrines. The sword judges Link based on the number of heart containers he has, and when a player manages to pull it from the pedestal, it's theirs to keep. It can actually break like any other weapon in the game, but it has a unique property where the sword will fix itself after a 10-minute timer has ticked down. In theory, I love this idea, and it goes along with one of my fixes that I suggested earlier. But in practice, I found the Master Sword's unique gimmick was causing me to devolve into some less than stellar gameplay behaviors. Because the sword can still break, and because I knew I would get it back, it instantly became the first weapon I used for every single combat scenario. Honestly, I can't really remember any times where I chose a different weapon first if the Master Sword was ready to go. This meant that towards the end of the game when the Master Sword was outclassed by other weapons, enemies became insane damage sponges, but it was still a trade I was willing to make to save a weapon for the end of the game. I didn't know what the final stretch had in store for me, so I kept wanting to save as many powerful pieces of gear as I could. My reliance on the Master Sword was so woven into my gameplay tendencies that I started to avoid encounters if it was going through its replenishing time period, so I didn't have to use something else instead. The 10-minute regeneration cycle also had the unintended side effect where I constantly found myself purposefully breaking the Master Sword to start the countdown when it was low on stamina. After every battle where the sword didn't break, I would go find a rock or tree or some other object to intentionally break it so I could be ready for any future encounter and still have it available. I used this strategy so I could always have the Master Sword ready for future encounters. I never wanted to risk it breaking during a fight, and I knew that I would get it back, so this became a legitimate strategy to save pieces of equipment. It's unfortunate that the wait time is so long between uses, because it means waiting and downtime, and I'm willing to bet that I wasn't the only one who not only thought of this strategy, but also used it. Taken all together, the weapon durability mechanic in The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild is a rare instance where the reception of it is completely subjective. There are definitely some things it does really well, like encouraging combat experimentation and overworld exploration. But then there are some things that definitely hinder it, such as creating the tendency to hoard gear or avoid conflict to save resources. The Master Sword was a decent attempt to encourage the benefits of the system while minimizing its negatives, but its execution was a bit flawed. It created both a cycle of waiting and downtime that could have otherwise been avoided, and that's probably not something the designers were going for. I do think that Nintendo should absolutely be commended for trying something so radically different with the Zelda series. But even after breaking it down like this, it's still so hard for me to determine if it's an awesome design choice or not.